All right, so World War II. So here we go. So let me give you a real quick recap for those of you who may say, but wait, I wasn't here. So World War II is not an event that happens ex nihilo. It's not an event that happens due to events and things in the 1930s. It has an ancient history. And as I try to stress to my students, you have to know the background of the context. And the context for this is not just the 30s. The context is deeper. So that's kind of why I guess maybe I lingered a little long last time when we got right up to the part where Adolf Hitler had in his Nazi party that he had actually met late in, it had already been formed before he got there. And he joined it and was so charismatic and so suave and so compelling in his speech that they ended up making him the leader. And they decided to try to copy Benito Mussolini's attempt at a more of a takeover than procedural elections. And it didn't go well. And that's kind of where we ended in the coming of the Great Depression. But just, again, making my larger point, World War II is not an event that happens because of the Depression. It's not even technically an event that happens simply because of Adolf Hitler or Mussolini. Instead, it's an event that has a long history that goes way back. So that's why we started with World War I and kind of made our way through. So you can see we kind of have this journey. It actually, if you wanted to get really kind of precise and yet not be in the 20th century, it starts with the 19th century in the aftermath of the Napoleonic Wars and the French Revolution, which, as I like to describe, unleashed a series of isms over the world to some degree, because they spill over into America and then eventually everywhere else through us and through the Europeans. And in this isms of things, very important words that you've all seen and know very well, these all kind of happen all at the same time. And as they happen, they, as I like to say, concoct kind of a witch's brew. Think of Macbeth and the three witches kind of stirring their mix together. And this then kind of leads into a setting that allowed for competition by the great powers. It is a multipolar world, as the foreign policy experts like to talk about. In the aftermath of that war, everybody was distressed, everybody was messed up, everybody was in peril, and everybody was unhappy. We had the Roaring Twenties, so you could say we were the one place where people were happy, but it's, in one sense, I think it's fair to say the American 1920s were kind of like the person who's just wrecked their car or found out that their spouse may be leaving them, and they go on kind of a drunken binge. And for the time that they're drinking and partying and maybe gambling all their money away, everything seems awesome. It's roaring, woohoo! And then, of course, as we know, the hangover comes later. And that's the 1929 Great Depression. Because if you ever study the Great Depression in depth, all of that did not happen because of the stock market crash in October, November. That happened because of things preceding it. And the clues for that crash are there. So you have this kind of disaster of things happening and everybody's unhappy, and all the key players. This is another aspect of what I'm trying to do here, is to not leave Japan out of the story as if what happens in the Pacific theater is independent of the world. Now, I do often tell people World War II is a misnomer. First of all, it's probably World War 15, if we're counting, or it's World War 0, because this was not a world war. There wasn't actual fighting on every continent in the world. So if we're using World War as a metaphor to suggest all the major players everywhere around, then there's probably 15 or so, depending on who's counting. But then secondly, by saying World War in a setting, it does feel like there's more coordination than there actually was. So another way to think of it is that there are two massive wars, a European war and a Pacific war, that coincidentally happen at the same time, with the United States eventually as the linkage in that, the United Kingdom to a lesser degree. But everybody's unhappy in their leadership. Because they're unhappy, every country that's the key countries goes through massive shakeup. Some getting dictatorships, some reversing field. We have a massive reversal. It's the only reversal through the 20th century until you get to Ronald Reagan's election, of a turning our back on progressivism, which is American socialism. And I don't mean that in a derogatory kind of way, but the idea that the government is deeply involved in what needs to happen to, quote unquote, make the world a better place. That was the ideology of the populists and the progressives. We're going to look at them in 2024 also, because a lot of people don't really know the populists. And you can see, of course, some of the famous names here: Mussolini, Stalin, here's Hitler. But it's every country is struggling with that. And then the Depression hits. And because the United States, through the 20s, had gotten deeply involved in the world economy, one key thing to think about that happens out of World War I, and this is perhaps instructive for our own day, is that the nation that had been the world's banker and the world's policeman no longer could do the job. So Great Britain was no longer in a position to do the job. And that left a lot of loose ends. Well, as far as the world's banker goes, not that we were volunteering to dominate the world economy, because we were the one major working economy, we by default became kind of this key player. In the middle of, again, sort of fallout from the failure of the Treaty of Versailles, we felt sorry for Germany, and we thought we could help things by economically stepping into a gap that they were into. It's a longer story, but that's the short version. So that we were tied to Germany. In essence, we were loaning money to Germany, and in some cases giving money to Germany. They were using that money eventually to pay off their debts of reparations to France and Great Britain, who then, of course, were paying back us for the loans we'd given them in 1914-19. And if you get that, you now realize why the Marshall Plan was us just giving billions of dollars away. It was like, yeah, forget it. Just take the money. Let's fix stuff up. We're not going to ask you to pay us back. And as you may know from the Marshall Plan, we just give billions of dollars away to Europe to try to help them in the aftermath. So all these things kind of happen in this moment. And one of the key ones, which is where we'll pick it up and head out with new material, is the Nazi Party, which had been a party developed in the aftermath of World War I, before Hitler's involved. It's a nationalistic party. It's technically inaccurate to call it fascist. Fascist party is the Italian version of this. But it usually becomes, and we talked about that in depth last time, what fascism is and how difficult it is for us to kind of wrap our heads around. But in any case, there's some similarities between what the Nazis were doing, and they were popular to some degree in Bavaria, but their attempt at an overthrow of Bavaria had not worked all the way out. But they weren't wildly popular until the Depression hit. And when the Depression hit, economic chaos came to Germany as it came to everywhere else. And in Germany, like a lot of places, the middle class lost everything. And so in that sense of, what do I do now? I mean, all of you probably at some level have money in the bank. Imagine in a week, it's all gone. Everything you saved for, your pension, all of it. What do you do now? What are you going to do on Monday? I mean, some of us would still be working so we could count on a new salary, but any savings you had accrued, any sense of stability that you thought you had, gone. And then there's a political party saying, well, A, we know who to blame, and B, we know how to fix it. Now, even though you and I probably think in terms of, well, prove it to me, kind of Missouri show me state stuff, many of us would see that as a solace and as a potential, this is something I'm going to get involved with. Because whoever currently is in charge who brought this ruin upon us, although the Weimar Republic government did not bring the ruin upon the German economy, it's, as we're saying, this kind of world system. So as you can see in the elections, they were doing well. They had risen up by 1930, but still. And of course, they're a parliament, so in a parliamentary system, you're not ever voting for the leader. The leader is whoever is the leader of that party, which in this case for the Nazis was Adolf Hitler. And he was you had to vote for them, right? So they have a seat that they're voting for. So it is correct to say Hitler was elected to office. But you're electing the party more than you're electing an individual, slightly different than how we do it, which many of you may know that. After the Depression really sinks in, you can see in the 32 election they won 230 seats. It's not large enough to have the majority on their own, but if you know anything of parliamentary systems, you've ever studied or hear what's going on in a whole variety of places in the world today, you know that these parties, whoever's the largest parties, end up being tasked with forming a government. So Hindenburg was a hero from World War I, and he felt like the best thing that he could do, and some other pretty rich industrialists felt like, what we need to do is we can use this youngish leader who's charismatic, and we can control him, and in controlling him, we can guide the country through this chaos. Well, much like French leaders will find out with Napoleon, some people are just too charismatic and too full of themselves to be controlled. And so that's kind of what happens here. Hitler is made basically the chancellor of the government. Unfortunately for Hindenburg and the plans that they had, then events quickly spiraled out of control. Because within a few weeks of him being made chancellor, their Congress building, the Reichstag, was involved in an incident. It's still not fully clear to this day, though most people believe that there's not enough evidence to somehow put the arsonist in connection with any other group. But at the time, you don't know that. All you have to do is think about any recent event that we've gone through. We're still trying to figure out what happened to President Kennedy. And so you go through those moments in the heat of the moment. Okay, that's where you have to place yourself at this moment with Germany. In the heat of the moment. And what Hitler does is what many of the previous chancellors had done. He used an aspect of their government in what was Article 48 that gave the chancellor dictatorial powers for a brief moment in time. The previous chancellors of Germany under the Weimar government had done this repeatedly. So it's not something that would feel like he did something extreme or out of the ordinary. When he did this, though, he was able to restrict communication, he was able to restrict and control how elections went, and the communication that would happen for different political parties. And as you can see then, with that, he was able to have better control over the Reichstag, and within a few weeks bring in what he called the enabling law. The enabling law is, in essence, for our purposes, the moment Hitler becomes the dictator. And look at the vote. Remember, his party was only 230 members. So in the heat of the moment, giving the chancellor the ability to try to root out whoever had tried to, from their point of view, destroy Congress building, for us, the U.S. Capitol building. Whoever did that should be punished. I was listening to something yesterday, and it doesn't matter the topic, but we have a pretty good narrative of what we believe happened in this country, and in a social event that if I told you the name of it, you'd say, I know all about it. I know that event. And now, a few years later, less than a decade, other evidence is coming out, which is calling the story into question. And then, if you're like me, you're like, well, with AI, I don't know if I can trust this new information. I don't think I can trust the old information. I don't know what's going on. And then you have the leader saying, I know what to do, and I'm going to do this. Give me the power. Trust me. There's a Freudian aspect to this, which we've talked about before, where it feels like maybe we all kind of lean into the, okay, Dad's got it. I want to go back to play my video game. I'm going to go back to messing with my flower garden. It's Christmas time. I'm going to get ready for the holidays. I'm not going to think about it. And I think that plays a role in kind of what happens here. Immediately, not surprising, with his power, he goes to work on what he believes to be the key issue. And we don't have time to focus on this. It's a topic I hope to do in the future for us, a real deep look at the Holocaust and kind of what happened in that moment. But suffice it to say, he puts his cards on the table really quickly. So there's no secret about this. And it's also important for us to note that Hitler is not singularly in this mindset. This is a European mindset that the Jewish people are either the problem or a key part of the problem. And that goes back to a long history involving banking, goes back to through the Middle Ages, and a whole bunch of things that began to transpire for Europe post-Constantine, so 300s-400s. What he did in Germany, perhaps we might want to be kind to the rest of Europe and say, maybe not to his level where they ended up going, the baking people in ovens, the terror of that. But what he said and did was in the minds of most people in Europe. I would be willing to say over 70% of Europeans would have supported him. And when you examine the Holocaust, what you find is I'm gonna say almost, but I think it's none. There's almost no nation in Europe that does not comply with the request and the opportunity to punish and get rid of their Jewish population. We would like it to be, it's a German problem, or it's a single nation problem or certain place problem, and this other nation refused, and even though they were no, that's not how it went down. So these are the key aspects of that, and you see early on with him putting Goebbels in charge. I mean, we go down a certain kind of road. That does not get us to the war, by the way. That's just the horror and terror for the Jewish people. But it hints at what the war will be like. You can study World War II singularly as a war on race and racism. And if you do that, you can kind of examine, and everybody's guilty, including the United States, of how that plays a role and kind of how that works out. So with this going on, then the nations have to figure out, how do I solve this economic problem? And for most, one, they kind of went down the road of their industry getting involved in the military. So Eisenhower's military-industrial complex is from the 30s. And they would look for ways then to use that military. There's an aspect of when you say, wow, the military-industrial complex, if the auto manufacturer is making a car to sell to you and me, they will sell one car because I will keep it for at least 4 or 5 years, unless I'm just excessively wealthy and I just want a new car every year, and I just turn that over, and that's certainly not the mindset of anybody in the 1930s. But if they instead make tanks or Jeeps, and I go to war, those tanks and Jeeps will be blown up, so that the purchaser, the nation, can order more tanks and Jeeps, so the industry keeps going because war is happening. You need war to be happening for the military-industrial complex to work. And if that's how you're planning on getting the country's economy going, which every country did, including the United States, which was Eisenhower's concern then in the 1950s, then you have to keep the country at war or it doesn't work. You're back to just go ahead and make cars and sell the few cars that you can sell to consumers. Does that make sense for everybody? So that aspect begins in the process. And you can see then there's a whole bunch of other issues that are involved. We're not in the League of Nations. We had joined France, and we talked about this last time, in this thing called the Kellogg-Briand Pact, which basically was a promise we'll wage no war. Japan, Italy, and Germany all signed on to that also. Obviously, everybody was lying when they signed it. And so it was not really clear like how we could fix things. People were really worried and frustrated. In Japan, Japan's going down a very similar road of trying to say, how do we grow stronger? How do we fix our economy? Japan, as we talked about, coming into the 20th century, is the way I like to describe it, creating or fighting for their own Monroe Doctrine. So there's another map. Is this map here? Here, look at this map real quick. Think about this from Japan's point of view. And think about the Monroe Doctrine. Remember, the Monroe Doctrine was our hemisphere over here, we're going to control. We may not own it, but we control who's there. Does that make sense for everybody? Well, suddenly the Japanese are like, that's a great plan. We should do that. We'll control our hemisphere. So what's our hemisphere? Say right here. But if you're Japan, look at this hemisphere. You got yellow, purple, orange, blue, more purple. Who are these people? And they're all Europeans. Well, what are these people doing here? They're not Asian. They shouldn't be here. And what were they doing in imperialism? They seem to be dominating and controlling the native peoples in a way that could be considered repressive. So from Japan's point of view, again, what did we say in the Monroe Doctrine? Hey, all you Europeans, get out of the Western Hemisphere. Leave these people alone. We, the United States, will protect their right for independence and freedom. And I know that didn't go perfectly, and in 1820-something when we wrote it, we couldn't have even defended it. But the point is, what we had said for over a century was, hey, nobody's in our hemisphere without our permission. And Japan's like, that's a great plan. But from Japan's point of view, who's in their hemisphere? All these other people, and they're doing bad things. To whom? To Asian peoples. Now, you and I know the rest of the story, that when Japan gets there in their co-prosperity sphere, things aren't exactly co-prosperous. But nonetheless, that was their mentality going in. And so when you look at it, there is this kind of sense of them trying to make their opportunity. Iki Kita is a person who was writing in the 1920s that we looked at, who basically was really stressing the key for Japan was to have a stronger military. So again, that fits into that military-industrial complex to kind of go there. And so in September of 1931, they had the opportunity to invade basically northern China. Manchuria is its own place. It's also to some degree part of the USSR, depending on who you're asking, who's drawing the map at that time. So they take that. Now this will put them in context with the USSR, and all of a sudden there begins to be a row of events. I'll go back to this map just for a second so you can see it. So here's Manchukuo. This is USSR. Here's Vladivostok, which is the Pacific port for the USSR, for the Soviet Union. Right? So this obviously puts them here. and they're on the border with these people. And so there began to be a whole bunch of border incidents in the process between the Japanese and the USSR as to who would control that land. Yet again, the League of Nations not in a place to enforce anything. And when they say, hey, you need to give that back, Japan said, well, we'll just leave. We don't need to be in this group anymore. And you can see then the weakness of these multinational organizations that progressives like Woodrow Wilson thought would save the world. All law is only as good as the willingness of every participant to obey the law. So if you and I start running all the stop signs, there's not enough police to put one on every corner where every stop sign is. And then you and I won't know how to approach stop signs anymore because we can't be certain people will actually stop. Think about just in the general sense of how transportation would happen in your neighborhood, how that breaks down. And so from that, psychologically, your entire trust of the system begins to break down. So law's only useful if you'll obey it. And Japan's already saying, well, we don't want to. They're not the only ones in this process. And this leads to a Japanese domestic crisis, which you can see best here. Because of this idea of what would lead Japan further into her greatness. You remember, at the time of the turn of the century, she was in an alliance with the United Kingdom, with Great Britain. And I think Japan in the teens, probably going into the League of Nations, had thought they and Great Britain and probably the United States could share control. Like we would be the good guys who control our various hemispheres. And collectively, it would be great economically and security-wise, and everything would be great. When they came to the League of Nations, they were promptly excluded, perhaps mostly by Woodrow Wilson, who has, if you know his history, has a deep sense of race and racism in him. I'm not saying he was necessarily anti-Asian, but certainly he was not supportive of Asian ideology and ideas in Paris in 1918-19. And so the Japanese left because they felt excluded and kind of demonized. So they found themselves on the outs, and by the time you get to the 20s and into the early 30s, to some degree, it's probably not fair to say we had forced, but England had been in a place where they kind of had to make a decision. Are they going to be friends with the United States, or are they going to be friends with Japan? And we had put them in a place where you can't be friends with both. And obviously, back to this map for a second, you know, of course, our control here are the Philippines, here's Guam, here's Wake, here's Midway, all coming out of the 1898 Spanish-American War. And economically, it was great for us to be involved in the Pacific theater of, of economy. But again, from Japan's point of view, you got to think about it from Japan's point of view, it's not great. And so we were a main competitor for them in that region. So in their own nation, you've got this kind of vision of kind of a world synthesis, and this is mostly business leaders and probably most of the non-military politicians. And on the other side, you had a younger generation. They just had some reforms in Japan that allowed people younger than 25 to vote. So you had this whole burst of young adults who were enthusiastic, who were pro for their country, and they were also kind of offended by what had happened in the Treaty of Versailles. And so they're on this pro-yay Japan side of things that ultimately will lead to the military control that comes out. The prime minister in 32 is assassinated. The military does not effectively take over at that point, but the nation's in internal turmoil over this issue. So you've got this kind of happening. Hitler and Mussolini are both going to copy this idea of using the military-industrial complex to kind of build up things. And so you can see one of the rules for the Treaty of Versailles was a cap limit on all military, basically, expenditures for the Germans. And Hitler basically takes the position of, make me. And so it's in 1935, he goes forward and makes this kind of charge to say we're going to increase. They begin, the German military leaders, not thinking at all politically, nor, to be fair, thinking about any upcoming war, but we're doing what people do in every industry. How can I innovate? How can I do something different? What would be something cool to try here? You're not necessarily trying to do something quote unquote wrong or bad. Nonetheless, the Germans are developing what eventually you and I will know as their blitzkrieg, their lightning warfare, rapid moving, responding military. And so in March of 36, against the Treaty of Versailles, they send troops into the Rhineland. If you ever wanted to think, could there be a moment to have stopped World War II as we know it, this is the moment. right here. And Hitler admits it. He knows that if France or England roll any of their troops in to confront them, he would have to back down. His own army leaders do not want to do this. But this is a hint of how Hitler's getting, again, it's easy and I think appropriate to not like Adolf Hitler. And at the same time, as a scholar, I need to be able to push back from that and just take it as neutrally as I can. And there are many aspects of when you look at Hitler neutrally, you go, wow, that guy was pretty sharp in a couple of ways, in a couple of moments. And he was a great read of other people. He gets crazier as he goes along because he starts doing drugs. By the time you're in 41, he's kind of beginning the process of losing his mind. So that by the time, if you ever want to see a good picture of it, go watch the movie Downfall. It is a horrifying movie, and I don't like horror movies or scary movies, and it's a chilling kind of movie, and it's Hitler's last days, and it's very well done, and it's fairly historically accurate. You know, most Hollywood movies aren't, but this one's really close. So he can read the room, and he's like, I think I can pull this off. Because what's the West doing? They're in their own turmoil. They're economically upset, and they don't have a leader who's willing to have the backbone to stop me. So I'm just going to go for it. And what he's going to be able to do is kind of play into this idea. One of the major failures out of the Treaty of Versailles is Woodrow Wilson's unleashing this phrase of self-determination, which is the heartbeat of nationalism. And it's a longer topic than we have to get into now, but you're going to see Hitler, Mussolini, and some of you read the Japanese, playing this card again and again and again. You guys said self-determination. So I'm asking for. Who lives in the Rhineland? A bunch of Germans. Why should we not have the ability to defend ourselves? Self-determination. And he knew that both the British and the French would not try to oppose him, that they couldn't try to oppose him. In Italy, Mussolini's doing the same thing. He's going to go even further. For Mussolini, he's determined to turn the Mediterranean back into an Italian lake. And to do that, he's going to replicate the Roman Empire. And so where he starts is in Libya. And he goes into Libya, and so there's definitely a dark side of what happens here in Libya of kind of brutal control of North Africa. This, again, touches into late 19th century imperialism. So you have to kind of do a whole session on 19th century imperialism, which is one of those isms. And Italy, of course, wasn't even a country until 1850, 1860, 1861 technically. But so they're late in that game of who can get what land. Of course, Libya's directly across from them, so that was a convenient one to go get. But then they take a step further and they go into Ethiopia. And so they use this to invade a foreign country. Ethiopia was one of the very few African nations that had not been conquered by Europeans. The Italians were on both sides of them, up here and down here, where they had taken over Somalia. And so they basically made a pretense, again, on self-determination. There's Somaliland, it's being held by Ethiopia. In other words, over here near Somalia, there's land where if you took account, there are more people of Somalian descent than there are Ethiopian descent, ergo self-determination. This is a failure of self-determination. It's an impossible thing to imply because you're always going to have some minority group of people living in various places. If you narrowly draw the circle, you can say in that place, they're the majority, so shouldn't they be their own thing? And this unleashing of self-determination was a terrible misreading by Woodrow Wilson about European nationalism, which is a whole story unto itself. They're not, the Italians are not as well positioned militarily, and it comes out. A European-based army probably should have rolled through the Ethiopians quickly. The Italians struggle, which was kind of a clue about how they're going to do in World War II. This gets into the frustrations and the complications of Europe. As I just told you, England and France could have opposed Germany in the Rhineland, but they don't. Part of the reason they don't is because of the sense of guilt over what happened in World War I and the Treaty of Versailles. And part of it is it's so complicated in Europe at this time. Is Hitler a bad guy? You and I can look at some things that happened in 33 and 34 and say, of course, just on that alone. But he was fairly elected. Is it the role of some other country to go to another country and say, well, you fairly elected a jerk, so we're going to come invade your country? And it should go to yourself, oh, that sounds familiar. Yes. And when you're the world's policeman, as we are today, If your neighbors are blasting their stereo, do you want to call 911 and have the cops break through their door every time the stereo is too loud? Most of us would say no, but then you get in that situation of what do I do when I'm unhappy with my neighbor, and it seems like there's not ever a good solution, and all those issues of human relations, as you probably know well from your own lives, kind of peter into that story. So, you know, the British were thinking being friends with Italy would be helpful against Germany. And remember, Italy had been on the Allied side in World War I, so maybe they would be again. So that means we need to turn a blind eye to what they're doing in Ethiopia. But at the same time, look at this. In 1935, the British had reached out to the Germans and had signed basically an agreement so that it, to some degree, caused a problem with France. So all these things are happening all at once that seem to make it unclear as to which way things should go in the process. Then the crisis spreads further because Spain erupts into civil war. The Spanish Civil War becomes like a preseason game. It's an opportunity for all the countries who are going to fight to use and try out their tactics. Unfortunately, not all the teams who are going to fight in 1939 to 45 come to play because the nationalists, the fascist Italians, and the Nazi Germans were happy to send their troops in. Meanwhile, the French and the British were not. The Russians were too far away, although they would have been more on the side of the Republicans. And so it's kind of a messiness that's involved. Notice how the League of Nations is helping Italy and not helping Italy. And first they're like, well, you're bad. And they rescind themselves. They go backwards. Again, if this makes you wonder when you see the UN Security Council kind of teetering back and forth between who's got the veto and who doesn't on a variety of issues, this is very similar to that moment in which it's not clear which way they're going to go. And eventually, as I'll show you in a second, Italy just said, we're going to leave the League of Nations also. Because it's just, I don't want to waste my time anymore. I'm tired of you guys telling us how to live our lives. This brings us to Franco. There's a whole sub-story here involving Spain, Spain's choice to not be involved in World War II. There's some debate amongst people, is Franco a fascist? I'm on that side that he's at least in league similarity-wise in the group he creates. That's very similar to what you see both in the Italians and the Germans. There are others who are like, no, it's not really fascist, it's something else. Some of that, again, is that idea that fascism is so difficult to pin down, and we want it to be more simple than it actually is. But between 1936 and 1939, he will successfully lead to the control and takeover of Spain, aided by Italian and German forces. For the Germans, this is a godsend, because everything the German military had wanted to be practicing, they're able to put into practice. Remember, the airplane is still relatively new. It had sort of been used, obviously, in World War I for battle, but there was still, it was still a novelty to some degree. What the German High Command was doing was working a way to better tie in new airplane technology to allow it to be more pinpoint and precise in its usage on the battlefield, which in what you and I know as dive bombers, and for the Germans, if you know the German Luftwaffe, the Stuka, right? But the idea of a plane, think about it, planes have just gone this way. That's all we really do. I mean, some of the more charismatic people in the 1920s could flip it around and do loop-de-loops, but diving it for the ground seemed unwise. And the Germans technologically began to work out a way to do that so they had control and then they could be more precise in their use. So the Germans were getting to practice all of this. And there you can kind of see some of the things that happened. In 1937, here in November, Hitler meets with his high command and basically lays out his plans. One thing about Hitler you have to keep in mind, he kept no secrets. You just read Mein Kampf, it is all there. There's no secrets about what he's going to do, which is sometimes why then the Rhineland opportunity seems so frustrating, because that was the moment when you could have possibly stopped him. But he kept no secrets, and one of the secrets was he's planning on in taking Czechoslovakia and Austria, which we're about to see in a minute. A couple of his leaders were kind of horrified by this, and they said so openly, thinking that they were in a place where they had free speech. He fired both, took their position. So now Hitler has taken the chancellor's role, he's kind of the nation's dictator, and now he's taken over command of the military. If you ever study the military aspects of World War II and the kind of strategic decisions the German military makes, one of the things that persist in making it worse for the Germans, which perhaps we could all say, well, that's good, is Hitler's constant involvement. But he does so not because he's megalomaniac, which he is, but because he took over the Minister of War. He's like, I am, in other words, to use our language, he became the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. So that's who's making the final decision in consultation with our president. Hitler's now both of those people. So he's got nobody to consult with in the process. And their war machine was top-notch. His military actually began urging him to not go to war at least until 43 or 44, because they had significant ideas they were working on, and particularly in both the realm of rocketry, jet fuel, and tank development. When you get to 43, 44, you can see where the Germans were going to go. Of course, the bad news for us, the good news for us is that didn't happen, right? The bad news for the world was that they would have probably gotten to splitting the atomic bomb, splitting the atom first, which would have obviously been horrific for the rest of us. Now, initially, Italy and Germany are on opposite sides of everything. Mussolini had met Hitler. He thought he was a buffoon. He did not like him. Hitler idolized Mussolini. He thought that's why he copied him in the Munich opportunity back in the 20s. And so they met. But now what's happened to Italy? They've been isolated. The French and the British are still wooing them a little bit, but now they're not so sure. And Mussolini begins, much like Japan, finding themselves on the outside. This is the moment when they will leave the League of Nations. And so I think Mussolini saw Germany as maybe an economic engine that could help him accomplish his goal of kind of dominating the Mediterranean. Again, much like Hindenburg, a pretty big misreading of who was in the room with you, with Adolf Hitler and where he was going to go. But you can see they kind of tying themselves together. This is where you kind of get this word Axis. It's never really officially called the Axis Group or the Axis Alliance. It's just a phrase that Mussolini used, in the process. This leads us to the Anschluss, so to Austria. All right, so Hitler's next move after taking the Rhineland was to try to deal with the German people living to his south in the state of Austria. We have to remind ourselves, we hear the word nation or nation state, and we see it as an independent organization within a geographic confine. But when you go back to European history, that's not the way to understand it. This is, again, part of Wilson's misunderstanding and from my point of view, massive failure in unleashing this idea of self-determination. For, at this point, 1,100 years, Europe, Central Europe, had lived like this. And if you go back to 800 when Charlemagne begins, all of modern-day France was also included in what was known loosely as the Holy Roman Empire. By at least 1100s, the city of Vienna, and by the 1200s, the family of the Habsburgs had become the dominant force in this place. So that's all you have to know for now. There's a lot more I could tell you, but for all you need to know is that this was Central Europe. And it was dominated by the family here in the Habsburgs in Vienna. So this is after, so you see the HRE is dissolved in 1806. This is after. And by the time you get to 20th century, Central Europe, which until 1870 is not anything, becomes Germany in 1870, was controlled by the Habsburgs in Vienna and the Hohenzollern family in Berlin, Prussia. So the Prussians and the Austrians. And they had a long rivalry going back to the 1600s. And they hated each other. They fought some wars. But from the Austrian point of view, we had run Central Europe for 800 years. We were it. And then suddenly in 1870, we were kicked out. Now, this is part of what leads to World War I, because as you can see, they want to continue having an empire, and as you know, they'll go south. They'll get involved with Serbia and the Balkans and the Italians and a whole bunch of other stuff involving European history in the late 19th century. But all that to the Anschluss. When the League of Nations had happened, the Austrians had requested, let us just be part of Germany. The Germans had said, let's make our former state of Austria back part of our nation. But because the Allies in 1919 were so determined to punish Germany, they said no. And so Austria now was no longer not only not part of Central Europe, not part of Germany. Go to Austria, maybe travel to Austria, they speak German. They don't speak Austrian. There's no Austrian, it's German. They not only were not part of Central Europe, they didn't even have an empire. Now they were just this little tiny, where's my map? Let me go to this. I don't think I've got a map real close, but basically, you know, Austria is a real tiny thing right here today. So that's kind of their setting. So from an Austrian point of view, they wanted to be included. They wanted to be allowed in. They weren't allowed in. But now, with the guy who's sort of in charge of things, who's kind of making his own rules up, they're like, well, you know what? Maybe we can do it. And so the pressure begins to mount that they want to be allowed in. And Hitler, of course, wants this because he wants Lebensraum. It's this idea expanding. And he's able to play the self-determination card. Who are these people? They're Germans. For you and me, we think of Austria as a nation, understandably, and that's correct today. But just think about it if Vermont had gone off on her own for 100 years, and then for a variety of reasons, or maybe better, Massachusetts, because our revolution starts there, and they kind of run the country, or Virginia, and then they wanted to come back. They wanted to be a part, and some other force, the UN or somebody was saying, no, they can't join you because you guys, you former United States, you're bad. You can't have that place back. Most people living there would still see themselves, probably, from a historical point of view, as part of the larger group, the United States. That's what the Austrians thought. So there's a variety of opportunities. There's a party that gets established in the 30s. They try a coup. It doesn't really work. They get a new chancellor here with Mr. Schuschnigg, and he tightens relations with Germany. So then in 1938, Hitler plays the card. Let's make this happen. Anschluss is not a Hitler made-up term. Anschluss is not a Hitler-determined activity. Anschluss is the idea of the union. And yes, many of us, we only know the Anschluss from watching The Sound of Music. And we understand when Captain Von Trapp tears the German flag in half and makes his comments. And there's that whole debate in their scene before the children sing their lovely song about going to bed. And they're kind of arguing the point. But Captain Von Trapp would have been in the vast minority. Now, the election that's held in April, 99%, that's not accurate. That's like the coming election that will probably happen in Russia, where President Putin will get probably 95 to 98% of the vote. And you and I know that nobody's voting freely in that kind of a place. However, it was certainly a majority and probably would have tended closer to 70% for them to be included in. So he pulls this off. And again, mostly met with wild applause. The Von Trapps are a real family. They really were opposed to the Nazi Party. And there were other Austrians also. But they were in the minority. And many of them did flee the country, like the Von Trapps, because they did not want to participate. But the majority of the Austrians were initially glad to be involved. They probably regretted it later, but they were glad to be involved. Well, what's happening in the USSR and how this takes us back to Japan? This is the moment when Stalin goes for his great purges, the great terror that occurs there. Again, part of a longer story, but Stalin continuing to tighten control. Remember, he had fought that battle with Engels back in the 1920s to kind of control after Lenin had died. And so he's continuing to tighten controls. And one of the things that he correctly noted was that if I'm going to be overthrown, it'll probably come from the military. So if I eliminate by killing nearly all of my military leaders, I then will be able to put my friends in power, and they will no longer be a threat to me. And that, of course, worked brilliantly. And, of course, cost millions of lives of people, over 1 million dead, 1.5 million sent off to prison camps. A horrific experience. Stalin is every bit Hitler's equal. If we're going to hate Hitler, hate Stalin as well. Arguably, he was worse. He just didn't do some morally as horrible things as putting people in ovens, which turns most of our stomachs appropriately. In this, though, Japan sees an opportunity. So their opportunity, remember, they're fighting battles up here, comes to them in a somewhat made-up event involving the Chinese in a railroad. And so they will use this moment here, the Marco Polo Bridge incident in July. And because they know what Stalin's going through, they realize they can to some degree abandon this northern front from a sense of guarding it. Remember, 150 incidents. So we can probably move our army south because the Russian army is in no place to bother us. So they do. And they begin what is the kickoff in the Pacific for World War II. This is really when World War II starts, not December 7th, this right here. And this really gets them into the variety of steps that will unfold between 1937 and 1941 that brings us into the war and really changes the issue for them. They obviously also contribute atrocities against other peoples, And you begin to say, wait, I thought you were trying to be co-prosperous with your other Asians, but it doesn't seem like that's the way it's working out for other Asian people. And they will be trapped. Maybe the first example of the quagmire we talk about with Vietnam, or perhaps, well, I won't mention it, but other nations are involved in right now where they're in a situation they can't get out of. And so Japan really has no way to conquer all of this. And because China itself was involved in not an open, but a somewhat, they're involved in a civil war between Mao and Chiang, between the communist movement in China. It's sort of what happens to us when we have the Mexican-American War. Towards the very end, there's no government in Mexico that we can have surrender. So President Polk actually sends our ambassador to Mexico City to help them set up a government so that government can surrender to us. But there's no government in charge, nobody can surrender. So that's kind of where the Japanese were, where the Chinese people themselves would not have all uniformly seen Chiang Kai-shek as their leader. So neither one was going to surrender, Mao or Chiang, but nonetheless the Japanese now are into something they can't get out of. But that then gives Japan a new problem to solve. If we are going to control our hemisphere, if we are going to be in a place where we can dominate, we're going to have to decide where we can get the rest of our raw materials. Because another way to understand World War II is that it is the first war of industrial magnitude. It's the first war over raw materials. Oil, rubber, metals. The United States, and to some degree the USSR, are uniquely situated on the continent, on the planet, that they've got almost every resource they need, at least up to current day, and I would still argue current day, we still have all the resources we need if we wanted to make just about anything that we wanted to try to make involving industry in 2023. Most places don't. So this lust or need for oil becomes a dominating factor. And so the Japanese are just like that. Now they got their oil from us. We are OPEC for them. And as you know, we're going to eventually start turning it off, which is going to be a problem for them. They actually are anticipating this. So how do we fix it? We go get our own oil. We'll go get our own raw materials. Well, where are they? Well, they're both to the north and to the south of Japan. Up in the east side of Asia and in what was then called the Dutch East Indies. But all that down in modern-day Indonesia, down in that area. Which way should we go? And one thing that's happening for Japan at this time is that their military is not working together. In fact, they have a deep rivalry. I think, have we already had the Army-Navy football game? I mean, in America, we have the Army-Navy football game. We understand there's kind of this fun rivalry between them, and of course the Air Force and the Marines sort of involved somehow. But we always, Army-Navy game. But we have a Joint Chiefs of Staff, and at least to date, our military's always worked as one unit in whatever we're engaged with. The Japanese rivalry was much deeper than that. So army leaders wanted to further the action of the Japanese nation's growth through the army, which means you need to fight on land. The IJN, the naval leaders, wanted to find a way to get their own opportunities for glory, and to do that you have to fight in the water, which means the Pacific. So the army uniformly believed in what was called Strike Group North. Attack Russia, attack the USSR, take their land. The Navy, Strike Group South, go to the Dutch East Indies, go down to Singapore, go down to that area, which involves all those islands in the Pacific. But then remember where the Philippines lies. That means potentially an issue with the United States, maybe. Well, they got a reading from their point of view about the United States in the Panay incident. They attacked one of our ships, openly flying our flag, basically sunk it, ran it aground. Some soldiers were injured, a few were killed. We protested. They said, oh, we're sorry. And we did what most people in the West would think is appropriate to do. We said, okay, I appreciate your apology. We'll just let it go. I'm not going to go to war with you over this one incident. The Japanese at that time, with probably a corrupted understanding of the Bushido Code, that was a sign of weakness. That was a sign of being afraid. That was a sign of having no backbone. And it strengthened the Strike Group South viewpoint. Remember, the fights with the Russians, and we'll see more in a second, they had not gone well for Japan. And so the Russians, they thought maybe the USSR is going to be tough. Now, what are we doing at this time? Well, we're trying to stay out of it. I don't think it's fair to use the term isolationist a lot of times in the United States. This is really more a reflection of what I call the Washingtonian doctrine. George Washington, from his farewell address, we should have economic ties with other nations, but we should not be in alliances with anybody. Don't be in alliances with a single soul. Certainly, 246 years later, you and I might argue that that's no longer effective in 2023. But in the 1940s, particularly after the disaster of World War I, which was perceived as a disaster in the United States, yeah, we're going to go back to that view. But I do think it's fair when you get to this point to talk about us from an isolationist point of view, because the world certainly had shrunk. And Congress was determined to not get drugged back into any conflict. And if you remember your story from World War I, a key part of it was our shipping being impacted by the war, both the British and the Germans in 1914-19. And so that made us wary. So all the plans, as you can see in these acts, are us saying, we're staying out of it. We're not going to get involved. So that's playing in the minds of Americans. And as the Ethiopian thing has happened, as the Manchurian thing has happened, as the Spanish Civil War thing has happened, the United States populace, I mean probably to 85%, if you put it to a vote, was like, we are not going to, no, you guys want to kill yourselves and fast track to hell, you go ahead. We're not doing it. We're not going to send another generation off to die. So that was our viewpoint as we're kind of moving our way forward. Now we turn then to Czechoslovakia. Make sure I'm on schedule for my time. I think I'm good. Yeah, we're a little bit where I wanted to be. Now, this is the third piece for Hitler. He's going in a circle. We're going counterclockwise. Rhineland, Austria. This land here are the lands of the Sudeten, although not all of them, but it was basically known generally, the Sudetenland. When Wilson and the other leaders, Clemenceau and Lloyd George, and all their brilliant idiocy in 1919 decided they would create the Czech Republic by itself, both the Czech Republic and here the Slovakian Republic wanted to be alone, self-determination. They were forced to be together, which is a whole different story. But in the process, it was determined to make them better defensible against the Germans. Because remember, World War I, who's the bad guys? The Germans. You had to make sure that they had defensible terrain. Now this gets into military stuff, which I don't expect you to understand or necessarily care about. We talked about this briefly last month, if you were here, we talked about the Battle of Antietam. But in the military, it's always sort of a math equation. I know that involves human lives, and that's crass of me to say it that way, but it's a math equation. Who's got the most people, or what other factors are involved? And mountains are a defensible terrain. So you're going to have less people battling a more numerous enemy, and if you're in the mountains, it's like having a multiplier effect for your troops. And it's historically true across all of human history. All of this is mountains. So is this right here a little bit, but this right here is mountainous terrain. So it was decided to give that to them, even though nearly 100% of the people living here were German. Actually, a lot of the people living here were of German descent. The Czech people are not German. If you go to Prague, they don't speak German. They speak Czech, or Bohemian if you want to go further back. Like the word Bohum is right there. But this was given to them. So Hitler's like, that's our land. Self-determination. So come on, give it up. And he begins making that movement. Now, unlike the Austrians, the Czech people were, no, we're not going to, no, we'll fight you. And they realize we've got the defensive position to do it. In May, he's able to get support from Mussolini. Again, support for what? For attacking Czechoslovakia? No. As you'll see, Mussolini's actually growing more afraid that a war is going to start. And what Ethiopia has shown him is, my troops are not really all that good. So not the Italian people necessarily, but technologically, we're not necessarily as positioned for a war as the Germans. And now he's beginning to worry about this partnership. He's kind of like, oh, this guy Hitler, he seems a little gung-ho for fighting. And I don't want, but Hitler's request of, I want the Sudetenland. I want back the land of Germany. I want the German land where if you took a vote, it'd be 80, 75% German. It should be ours. And come on, self-determination. Mussolini says, yeah. This gets us to Great Britain's position. Now, in 1937, Neville Chamberlain had become the prime minister. Previous to this, he was chancellor of the Exchequer. Now, he gets a lot of grief piled on him by people who studied World War II, I think most of that is misplaced. And you would have done much the same, particularly if you were in Britain. But let's see if I can explain it. Previous to this, when the invasion of Ethiopia, he had seen, and he was right, that the League could no longer be relied upon by itself to secure the peace of the world. In other words, Chamberlain comes out and says what people like Woodrow Wilson would not have wanted to admit, that, hey, it's a great idea, we'll all sit around and have a conversation. And, just to put my cards on the table, I think the UN is not much better. And instead of having, 75 years of no war, you and I know we've had 75 years of only war. And the UN seeming incapable of stopping it. Well, there's reasons why I think human history would tell us. That's a different rabbit trail, Carl. Don't go down that road. But I'm just saying, don't put your hopes in some organization that's supposed to supposedly enforce something that you know is unenforceable. You were here when we did civics 3 months ago, one of my professors, and he talked about the realistic school of foreign policy. And you don't have to buy in on his full thing, but I do think it's important for us to say what can happen, not what I wish could happen. And you have to then, from my point of view, work from there. And so Chamberlain's saying it. Now, unfortunately, then, he's going to then pull into this idea of appeasement, and you're going to kind of see it. Now, he wanted to rearm while also getting better relations. It's not peace through strength like Reagan, but you can see Chamberlain recognizing, because we focused out of the New Deal more on social concerns and more on kind of the government using its money for a variety of social situations that have merit and may need to be solved. We have not spent any money on rearming and on improving our technology. This will be why Singapore and Hong Kong fall so quickly when they fall, when the war begins, because the British who ran both those places had not done really anything in the previous 20 years to improve their technology and their defensive capabilities. So he's going to try to move into this idea of appeasement. And again, you have to put yourself in the place of the French or the British or the Americans. I just showed you the Americans. We don't want to get involved, and we got a whole two oceans between us. Britain has a channel, but that's not much. And of course, France is right there on the continent. We don't want to go back to war. Isn't there a way to not go back to war? And the way to not go back to war, you hope, is by making concessions. You hope that will appease the other. And so that's the whole viewpoint of where they were going. Except for taking the position, and certainly Churchill will become, at the end of it, when you look at it, you say, well, he was right. Yes. And probably 80% of us in the room here, maybe 90% of the room, would have voted for Chamberlain, not Churchill. Because what was Churchill promising, what he said later? I have nothing for you but blood, sweat, and tear and war. And in this room right now, if our president said similar to that, we would all be horrified, because none of us want that. I don't like the whole war thing. I don't own a gun. It's not my style. What do you do if it's what's required? So in any case, he's trying to figure out how pragmatically deal with internal issues from a social point of view, as well as now this rising threat. And so he determines he's going to go meet Hitler. He says, I need to see him face to face. Chamberlain believed that he had the capacity to also read the room and get the measure of the man. If he did, it will be turned out that he was incorrect here about Hitler in the process. So for Hitler, he recognizes, one, locationally, nobody can help Czechoslovakia. They're just too far away from everybody. But then also psychologically, I don't think anybody's going to come help them. I don't think it's possible. So he's thinking, I need to keep pressing. Now, you have to understand that Hitler is, from the moment he becomes the chancellor, there are numerous attempts on his life and or attempts to take over the party, if not by killing him, then by eliminating him and his leadership. You know probably 2 or 3 of the famous moments, but there are several. So again, from Hitler's point of view, you can't sit back and rest on your laurels. There's a couple of moments where if you're playing a video game of World War II, and you're playing the Germans, you might decide, I don't need to make that attack. I don't need to go there. I can just sit and rest for 6 months and let my money build up or something. But that's not accurate because people hated you. It's not accurate that the German people, once the war begins, are somehow all gung-ho pro-Nazi. Many of them are, but remember there's no more elections. So there's no real way for us to gauge that. And if you spoke out at your peril, much like in Russia today. And so you always have to kind of measure that, and I'm not trying to absolve Hitler of anything, nor absolve the German people who certainly, absolutely knew of the death camps that were their neighbors. And it's to their great discredit they didn't try to do something. However, for you and I, as the scholars, we're trying to just walk our way into it and say, well, can I understand what's happening here? And so from the German position point of view, Hitler at least is saying, I cannot sit around and wait for things to just transpire. I got to make things happen. So he's kind of eager to press into this. He meets Chamberlain, who's eager to avoid a global war. So in Chamberlain's mind, is there a way to possibly give up the Sudetenland to Germany, and will that make him happy? And you can see Hitler's charged to him. Look, if that's really where you are, if you're prepared to recognize the principle of the right of people to self-determination, you can just see Hitler throwing down that on him. Like Woodrow Wilson. I mean, you weren't personally there, but your boy was there. Lloyd George was there. You all signed in on this. Self-determination. It's what we're talking about. Then we can continue the discussion or see how the principle can be applied in practice. Hitler was absolutely a bully. And if you've ever been around a bully, then you know sometimes they know how to use their verbosity and their loudness and their anger and what can come off at times as unhinged nature. There's very famous stories about Andrew Jackson blowing up in his cabinet to the point that they freaked out and would be cowed by him. They would leave the room and he'd turn to his aide and said, they thought I was mad, didn't they? Total game for him. And if you've known somebody who's a bully, you say, yeah, I've lived through that. And it's hell to live through something like that. And that's who Hitler was, and he knew how to use that effectively. They meet, and then Chamberlain goes back. He thinks maybe we could kind of work things out, but Hitler's own situation, he's not going to sit around and not, wait on European determination to kind of work a way out. So about 3 or 4 days after they met, it's pretty clear Hitler's going to go to war, and Czechoslovakia is going to defend itself. And had they gone to war and fought in the mountains of the Sudetenland, it's not clear who would have won. The Blitzkrieg does not work in mountains. So it's not clear what would have gone down had they fought that war. But Hitler recognized nobody's really going to, defend them in the process. By the way, again, the German generals were opposed to this. Remember, they don't want any general war until maybe 1945, maybe not to 1950, when they would know they would have an insurmountable technological advantage. Chamberlain keeps working behind the scenes, and he finally comes up with a plan to have a 4-nation meeting. Him, Hitler, Mussolini, and France. Unfortunately, nobody wanted to invite any of the Czech leaders, which you should be totally offended by that and see the horror of the moment. On the 28th, Hitler agrees. He sends a note to Chamberlain. Chamberlain's giving a speech in the House of Commons when this happens. Notes past him while he's talking. He stops and reads it, and then says, I've been announced that Chancellor Hitler is willing to meet, basically postpone war. House of Commons breaks out into applause. Chamberlain was not appeasing on his own or in some way that the British people were not fully in support of what he was doing. So they meet in Munich, this very famous Munich conference. There was a recent movie about this, and I can't remember the name. I think it was on Netflix, actually. It was very good. It's chaotic because nobody was in charge. Mussolini tries to play senior diplomat, tries to kind of work it out. And in the end, you just get like 3 or 4 moments of Hitler kind of freaking out and stomping out of meetings and being mad and kind of arguing and kind of blustering. And eventually, it is concluded that they will give the Germans the Sudetenland. And Hitler's like, all right, I've won. Then at the last minute, Chamberlain, unknown to his own security detail, and basically goes to Hitler's apartment where he was in Munich alone and gets Hitler to sign a statement that says our nations will not go to war. If you know the very famous picture or famous film clip of Chamberlain getting off the plane in London and waving a piece of paper saying, I have peace in our time, he's waving the document that Hitler signed. When Hitler signed it, he didn't even read it. He just signed it for Chamberlain. So it's an example of 2 men having very different perceptions about what just happened, what just went down. Chamberlain's, I've got it. Chamberlain's got to get the House of Commons on board. Remember, just 3 weeks before, fortnight before, House of Commons had cheered lustily at the promise of no war. Chamberlain goes into the chambers, makes a speech. Here's what I've agreed. Here's also what Hitler signed to. The Labour Party, which is in opposition at the time, gets up and makes a very strongly worded speech against this plan and against what Chamberlain had done. All of a sudden, you can imagine Chamberlain going, wait a minute, you all were cheering for me. And then to his shock, Winston Churchill got up and made a very important and famous speech in which he blistered Chamberlain and openly mocked and defied Adolf Hitler. Well, guess who's listening on the radio? There's very good evidence that suggests there's a, I don't want to overstate it. You can see the vote, it was approved, but there's some evidence at least that Hitler might have followed through on the agreement. And the agreement, again, the first part of the agreement is just the Sudetenland. The rest of the Czechoslovakian lands will be left alone. But when he heard the derision from people like Churchill, he took it personally. Again, go back to a bully. Many bullies are thin-skinned. The moment you say anything about them, and they have long memories, and they fly off the handle because you insulted them. And that's what happens for Hitler. Now, he doesn't immediately invade the rest of the Czech Republic, but basically just a few weeks later, as the Czech and Slovakian leaders were negotiating amongst themselves as to what this means, Hitler had already said he wanted to set up a Slovakian republic, which Slovakian leaders were like, yeah, cool, that's what we wanted in 1919. And there's some debate. Hitler used their dissension as a reason for invading. And so he invades the rest of the Czech Republic and takes the rest of the Czech Republic. That was not actually on the initial plan of Hitler. It was probably going to fall to his hands anyway within a year or so, had he just had a little patience. By doing it the way he did, the best way to say it is that he completely lost the support of the rest of Europe, which I'm about to show as we head our way to Poland here as we wrap up. So here's where we've gone. There's the Rhineland, which had been still part of Germany, but not allowed to be occupied by troops, and they'd taken that. Here's Austria, where the Anschluss had happened. Here, the outer, can you see the outer of this? This is the Sudetenland, which they took first, and then they took the rest in March of 39. They create Slovakia as its own country, which the Slovaks wanted. Not trying to blame the Slovakians, but just to make the point. And the Slovakians will be like the rest of Eastern Europe, minor partners with Germany in the rest of their wars, particularly with the USSR. And this sets us in motion for going to Poland. Now, before we do, I want to make sure that we get all of our pieces on the table as to what's happening here. Now, do you remember on the slide I showed you about what happened immediately after Hitler became the chancellor, and we talked about the racial things? If you notice, 1938 is when Kristallnacht happened. So putting it more appropriately in its chronology, the agreements made with Chamberlain, I've got peace, Hitler's happy, I got what I want, we're good to go. Now he's still going to he's still going to Poland, because Danzig, again, self-determination. So he's definitely going there. But it would have been a different story had he gone with this sense of, hey, he could have said to England, you can't support Poland because you promised no war with me. In any case, he hears the negative comments by people like Churchill and the Labour Party, and so then he goes ahead and takes it without waiting, the rest of the Czech Republic. Chamberlain then at that point comes out and says, you know what, I can't deal with this man. He promised, he broke his promise, and that was the last straw for Chamberlain. He then begins pushing in deeper. We're going to have to rearm and start spending money on rearming now. It's going to be too late to have an early effect. It'll pay off later by 43. It'll pay off for the British to have done that. But notice in that same time period is when Kristallnacht happened. So between the Munich meeting and the rest of taking the rest of Prague, Kristallnacht. So if you'd done an opinion poll in Britain at the time of the Munich meeting, I think it would have probably run 70-30 in support of Chamberlain, which then tacitly you could say is in support of Hitler. Not directly, that's not fair, but you get the picture. But once Kristallnacht happens, and it was not hidden, it was out in the open. It's clearly, this is what we're doing, which for Germany and for Hitler and for the Nazi Party, that's just a continuation of where we've gone. They would have said something, this is hurtful and offensive. They would have said, we've been trying to get these people to leave. We've been pushing, we've made it as hellish as possible, and they won't leave. So now we're just going to go and just really do some damage to their economy and then start putting them into the ghettos. I'm just tired of these people being here. But that it happened at this moment was crucial in turning the opinion in the West, particularly in Britain. France was probably already more than 50-50. They were probably already leaning because they're closer. But Britain was like, yeah, I'm not so sure, but it basically would have flipped probably more like 20-80. And the 20% not in support of Hitler, the 20% simply not wanting to go to war. Like, let's not go to war. Can we find a way out? But nobody after Kristallnacht and the invasion of the rest of Czech Republic or Czechoslovakia could have said openly they support the appeasement efforts that had been going on for the previous 3 years. Okay. So, turns to Danzig. Now, this gets into a real complicated relationship between Hitler, the West, and USSR. So, Hitler had, with Austria, he had kind of bullied the Austrian leader. With Czechoslovakia, he had used his own bullying concepts with both Chamberlain and with Czech leaders. He tries that with the Polish leader, and the Polish leader is unfazed. There's one story of him being in a meeting with Hitler for 3 hours, with Hitler basically not allowing him to say anything. I almost wondering, Hitler probably needed a transfusion afterwards of just screaming at the man. And the Polish leader's like, not going to happen. I'm not going to give in to you. Location has a piece of it on the Baltic. Would have been a little easier for the British to somehow help them. And because Chamberlain had made a speech basically right after this whole thing had happened to say, we will support unconditionally Poland. So the Polish leaders are like, all right, we think they'll be in support. Now, before we get to the invasion itself, just realize most people still do not understand what the Blitzkrieg will look like, particularly in a terrain setting that is well designed for that speed attack. So most people assumed a war between Germany and Poland would at least take 6 months, if not maybe a year. Obviously it's not, but they don't know that yet. They don't understand. It's sort of like right now we're all learning about warfare with drones. We're all watching it happen in real time. And 3 years ago, nobody would have really ever thought what would drone warfare look like in 2023 in the world. And now we're all watching it. We're like, oh shoot, that's a little scary. I don't know what that looks like. Notice Chamberlain does not give up fully. He tries one last attempt, and he offers Germany, Hitler, an alliance. If you just back down, dude, take the stuff you've got, go home happy. You're good. And an alliance could have led to economic ties, support. We'll go from there. But remember, Hitler can't do that because he's propped up the German economy through military-industrial spending. And, as I've said, he's facing his own consistent assassination attempts or attacks. And by this point, if he hadn't done this before, Mr. Hitler certainly was at this point having an extraordinarily inflated view of himself. He is now beginning to believe that he's destined. He's beginning to believe that he's incapable of error. He's beginning to believe, because he's now countered different people's opinions, his own military, other domestic leaders, other European leaders, and in his mind been right every time. So that's obviously a dangerous recipe for a person who already is confident to have a series of events happen in which they're not unfortunate, they're very fortunate, and they work out the way you want. So Hitler's now gone down that road where he can't really see that he's in any kind of trouble, so he kind of blows it off. Now, in the background is Stalin. Stalin's playing a game also. Remember, on his far east, he's dealing with Japan. He's not sure what they're going to do. And he's still coming out of his time of the terror. His military's in trouble. He knows his military's several stages behind. The Italians probably could beat the Russians. That's how bad his military was. And he's getting rid of all the key leaders. So he knows he needs time. He's got to figure out, how am I going to do this? He doesn't initially reach out to the Germans. He's actually reaching out to the British and the French. But remember, Mr. Stalin's a communist. So if you're Britain, or you're France, or you're the United States, you can't get in that bed. And so there's challenges as to, well, what are we going to do and how are we going to do it? So there's kind of this double game. Now Hitler, I think, recognizes that this may go to war. There's other things when France and England declare war, where Hitler like literally shot. Like, I can't believe it. But I think he recognizes, I need to protect and only fight one war, which will be with France and England. So the way to do that is to ensure that there's no attack from Russia. Both Stalin and Hitler and both of their militaries had assumed a war between each other sometime in the next 10 to 15 years. And they did military gaming for all that. But for the moment, it was convenient for both to kind of work stuff out. And so they tried that. Both Ribbentrop and Molotov are tasked by their respective leaders to try to work out an agreement, if at all possible. Now, Molotov also was responsible for getting an agreement with Britain, if possible. So they're kind of playing both cards in the process. Stalin's got to watch out for Japan, because at this very time, there's a whole other series of battles in 38 and 39. In both of these battles, the Russian military, it's really a draw on the battlefield. But from Japan's point of view, the USSR looks strong. Like, defeating them will take a supreme effort from us. Should we go ahead and strike north? Or we know striking south, we've got people who are weak, those Westerners. And can Britain really get over here and defend Singapore if we go that way? The United States, they've already rolled over once, so there'll be no problem whatsoever. We just got to figure out a way to smack them around. When we go down that road, we think we're good. So Stalin's thinking this also. And so because of these battles, as you go into mid-39, summer of 39, the Strike South group in Japan is winning the discussion, meaning the Japanese diplomats are alluding and letting Stalin know, we're probably not coming your way. And in fact, they'll be in Berlin at the time when Ribbentrop and Molotov are working things out. We'll fly back to and land in Moscow, and in Moscow we'll sign their own non-aggression pact with the USSR. So when the war begins, that side is Italy, Germany, USSR, and Japan, because the Ribbentrop-Molotov pact will be signed, allowing Hitler and Stalin to divide up Poland and take, well, it's 2/3, 1/3, but to take their own pieces. The Russians are also going to get all the Baltic lands. They're going to get to control Ukraine. They're going to get kind of carte blanche to the rest of their lands, places like Georgia. All those names, certainly Ukraine, should alert your brain to going, wait, haven't those places been fighting independence wars since 1989 when the USSR fell apart? And hasn't Russia been invading all those places? Yeah, all that stuff goes back to here. It actually goes further back, but that's our problem for today. So August 20, they sign a trade agreement. That's the open part. The secret part, the trade agreement was, you, Russia, or USSR, you're going to give us oil, raw materials, and food. Where from? Ukraine? We're going to give you military tech, which you may say, that sounds dumb. Why would you give them military tech when you're assuming a war? If you think about it like numerically, like say 0 is terrible and 10 is the best, the Germans were like at a 7 in this point, maybe 6.5. But the Russians were at a 2. So you're the Germans, you could give them a 4, and it's going to be an improvement for the Soviet technology. So the Soviets get what they want, but you're at a 7, so you're still going to beat them in a 1-on-1. Does that make sense? So that's what they do it. But then secretly, we're going to split things up, and that, of course, it leads us to the end. The pressure on Poland builds. Now Mussolini gets into it, trying to stop the war, because he realizes we do not want to go to war. And in fact, he reaches out to Hitler eventually by phone going, you know that division I promised you? We're not going to send it. We can't go to war now. You probably shouldn't go to war now. Let's let the dust settle. And Hitler, at this point now, is the senior. He's the more mature. He's been more successful than Mussolini. So he's like, no, I'm not listening to this. So all these efforts to try to stop the war do not work. Here's where the troops are laid out. We're not really going to do much of a battle. We'll show you really briefly, just real quick here. And this is old Prussia, right? So this is where the Hohenzollern family first started, back over here. So this, out of World War I, had been left to them. But what? You're gonna, lifetime. The Treaty of Versailles is the most instrumental, it's 103 years old today. It's the most instrumental and destructive decision the United States has ever participated in. And we have Woodrow Wilson to thank for it, and I do not like that man, so I'll stop there. Sorry, I do not like that man. So, they got this land. It's a long story. But that meant the Germans could attack from 3 sides. Old Czechoslovakia down here, and Slovakian land. the German land itself, and Old Prussia, which they do on September the 1st, as you know. So we've arrived. Here we are at the end. It's a devastating attack. What's interesting, though, is the peace talks keep going. Both the Italians and the British keep trying to reach out. Because again, what Hitler said he wanted was Danzig. So they don't know about the secret agreement with the USSR. Hitler already knows, I'm taking all of Poland. There's no reason not to. The USSR is going to come in. We're allies, at least for a brief moment. We get our part, they get their part. It's not going to be a struggle. We're not going to fight for anybody. And Hitler seems to be the only person, Stalin was shocked, who understood what his blitzkrieg could do. He's the only person. Again, everybody else sort of thought it was going to go maybe for 6 months or something, and Hitler's like, nah, we'll be there quick. And he was right. And so they just blitzed through it. Most of the Polish Air Force is destroyed on the ground. It's the size and scope of what industrial warfare looks like now became apparent to everybody with the Polish invasion. And this is just a quick map here. They're able to kind of swing around, the whole blitzkrieg effect. This is, I think it's his Rommel's group, or not Rommel, but I lost my train of thought. Who am I looking for? I don't know. Sorry. I'll show it in a second. I know it's on here. I'm trying to get out of time. And the Poles are fighting really a normal war at this point, a World War I battle. And they're just getting outflanked and outpassed. And the whole concept of blitzkrieg is to do this. You kind of surround people and trap them. And eventually the Poles were thinking, we'll come down here towards Romania. This is before the Russians announced their attack. And we'll be able to kind of get a counterattack here. We can hold out for a long time. Eventually the British will come. But no, of course, that will not happen because they will, by September 8th, they're already in the outskirts of Warsaw. Again, here's Poland can hold out for 3 to 6 months. Not really happening. He does offer to pull out, but the House of Commons says no way. You have to give everything back. And at this point, you can see the lines have been drawn. Britain's going to fight. They're going to protect what they believe or fight back against this over-aggressiveness, and they're going to try and stop in the process. So eventually, Guderian, that's the name I wanted. I'm so sorry. Guderian is the one who was sweeping around here. So the Polish people are kind of surrounded, and then on the 17th, the USSR. It would have been quicker. Stalin did not assume that he had to worry about timing. In fact, there was a moment in which the Germans could have easily taken all of Poland, and there was a brief concern amongst the Russian high command of like, are we going to have to fight the Germans? Because we'll lose. And then Hitler gave out an order, no, pull everybody back. This is the agreed upon line. Stop here. We did our part, and so the Russians were able to kind of do their part and take over. Warsaw surrenders. Poland surrenders on the 27th. And that's where we are, right? The whole thing's over. This gives you a scope here, right? So over 200,000 people killed, 14,000 Germans lost through the Blitzkrieg. The Blitzkrieg was so creative and successful in the correct geography. So it's not going to work in Russia, as you already know. And it's a disaster for the Poles, right? You have close to 6 million people being murdered, and it's just a disaster. The first of clear evidence for what this will look like when the Germans work out what Hitler said he would do. Well, I mean, Hitler's not holding any secrets and not doing what he said he would do. He's doing what he promised, and so this is our map. So again, this is now here. Slovakia is its own place. The Germany, quote unquote, is all this. Then all this is now being given, including, and this is obviously showing Ukraine is already part of the USSR. They were, but the Ukrainians were already having an independence movement at this point, which the Russians were brutally put down. And that's our story. As you know, World War II is now on. Britain and France have said they are in. President Roosevelt, Franklin Delano, comes out openly in support of the United Kingdom, begins working in Congress to not undo the isolationist effects, but begins, for Roosevelt, he also seems to be someone who's a good read of another human and says, we're going to have to be involved at some level. And so he begins really trying to maneuver and will through the rest of 40 and into obviously 41 before we're attacked in December to put us on the side of the United Kingdom and on the side of France and the Allies as they were known, as they're involved in that. And with that, we have made it to the end. And do you have any questions? I mean, there's a lot you could ask. Do you have any questions or anything you want to ask me before we charge our way, hopefully, into a more happier topic with our holidays? where we will be. And any questions? If not, that's great. Yes, sir.
So, put yourself in the room. The whole Chamberlain Hitler thing is fascinating to me. I've read quite a bit of the details, and some of like the direct internal reports. The whole story is fascinating. But after Munich, it's interesting. Like, I guess the question is, you personally, how surprised was Hitler when England and France actually declared war? Because by that time it seemed kind of obvious that he had crossed the Rubicon, and he knew he had.
Yeah. It depends on which day you talk to him, I think.
Exactly.
Because there are some aspects where he genuinely seems, once they announce on the 3rd September, where he genuinely seemed surprised.
And he seemed genuinely worried about it too. Like the idea he was telling his generals, like, guys,
remember, his generals are opposed to going to war.
Don't worry, they'll back down.
And he was proven right again, because for the rest of the fall, nothing happens. I mean, there's the Finnish war with the USSR.
What is it?
Sitzkrieg, or the phony war.
Yeah, the phony war.
One of those, yeah. But yeah, the Scythian War, the phony war. But in the process, it seems that he was aware that war was going to come, and he felt like he could take care of both. Hitler, to the last moment before the Battle of Britain begins, though, still believes that he could get an alliance with them. Like, he felt like he could work with them. But when Churchill became the prime minister after the fall of France, he knew that was going to be very difficult, because he knew Churchill hated him. So he was frustrated, because he felt like, in his worldview, the British people were akin to the Aryan German people. And so we can work together. We can be on the same page. And of course, the British people, after Kristallnacht, were uniformly opposed. Good question. Anybody else? You guys are a blast. Thank you so much. Have a wonderful, wonderful holiday season. I appreciate you so much. If you want to get in touch with me for any reason, here's my information. And I would love to see you have a wonderful holiday.
Thank you. Thank you.